Hello, I'm Susan Davis Faulkner, and I'm thrilled to be here today to share with you what I've learned about the history of vital records in the United States of America. Through this study, I have gained such an appreciation for what our ancestors have gone through in order to bring us those little itty-bitty pieces of paper that we so take for granted, our birth, marriage, and death certificates, and even the paperwork of our divorce decrements. I love statistics, don't you? I know that when I'm studying history or possibly looking at a different community in today's time space, I'll look at the demographics and the statistics that surround that area and that time. It helps me to gain a better picture of what was going on or what is going on, what those people during that time and in that place experience and experienced. Statistics help us understand, don't they? Whether it be something of a historical concern or whether it be more current. And we all contribute to statistics, whether we actually set out to do that or not. Well, today we're going to talk about vital records. And these vital records, you'll find out soon, all lead to statistical information. So in order to understand what we're going to be talking about as far as vital records, let's make sure we're on the same page. I looked up a couple of definitions of vital records, and this is what I came up with. In the business world, vital records are documents, files, or records in any form or format containing information that is essential to the operations and or survival of the organization. Well, that sounds pretty important, but I don't think that's what we want to talk about today. In the public health world, vital records are records of life events kept under governmental authority, including birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death certificates. Okay, now you've got my attention. But in the family historian world, vital records are just simply those historical records of ancestors that I can't live without. But is there really a history? I was preparing for a presentation on using family Bibles as a genealogical resource when I tripped upon this statement. Now, this was an introductory statement to an article titled Vital Statistics of the United States, Volume 1. It was written in 1950 by Ovida Kolb-Hobby and Leonard A. Scheel. And in their introductory remarks, they stated, national statistics of deaths and births were achieved only within the present generation, after 2 centuries of intermittent struggle and building. Wow, this sentence caught my attention in a lot of ways. The present generation, well, in 1950, the present generation really wasn't that far from where we are today. And after 2 centuries of intermittent struggle, well, again, if this article was published in 1950, 2 centuries would have taken us back before the formation of the United States of America. Yeah, I was curious at this point. So I dug into our first civil registrations. Some of our first civilizations in what would become the United States of America were Jamestown and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, Jamestown had its first settlers in 1607, and it took them 25 years of struggling to survive before they were able to come up with any kind of laws or legislative body to organize their settlements. Well, their legislative body was called the Grand Assembly, and this Grand Assembly passed a law requiring that a minister or a warden, some sort of representative from every parish, appeared at court annually on the 1st of June. And at this time, they were to present a register of christenings, marriages, and burials for that last year. About the time that this law was put into play, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had its first settlers. What was unique to the settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony is that they arrived with their initial governing documents in hand. They had figured this out before they got here. Still, it took them 9 years for their legislative body, the General Court, to order that a record book be kept of probates, marriages, births, and deaths. Huh. Okay, so by 1640, late 1630s, we're already seeing that we've got civil registrations. So why did it take the United States of America so long to come up with our vital registration system that we have? Well, let's look at why we even had those original registrations. James A. Weed, in his report titled The United States Vital Statistics System, dated in 2008, answers this question with this statement. The original impetus for civil registration of vital statistics was the protection of individual rights, particularly relating to ownership and distribution of property, and not for statistical uses. Okay, well, at this time, back in the 1630s with the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Jamestown, their emphasis was not really placed on statistical values or collecting data that would be used for statistics later. It was just collected to protect the individual rights, particularly in regards to land ownership of those people that it was keeping records about. Now, our founding fathers brought with them a lot of their culture and a lot of their ways of doing business. They brought with them the desires that were built in the fatherland of England, and that included the desire to own property and the freedom of religion. Well, one of the things that they were used to were called the Bills of Mortality, and this was a document that was created in 1538. The Bills of Mortality, as they were created in 1538, were simply a weekly postings of christenings, marriages, and burials. Now, don't go getting excited. This was not of any genealogical value. This was only a tally of how many christenings, marriages, and burials had occurred during the week. As the need for information surfaced, the Bills of Mortality changed. By 1570, we're seeing that a total amount of baptisms is also included. And by 1592, the plague was really getting to be a nuisance in England. And so they included records of death by plague into the Bills of Mortality. By 1629, they started segregating deaths. By this time, they were already including all deaths, but they wanted to know how many by what cause. So you see how the information in the Bills of Mortality is starting to get more and more populated. Let's take a little bit closer view at the Bills of Mortality. Now, the title on this is The Diseases and Casualties This Week. And it just gives a list of how many people died of these particular diseases in this week in 1638 in England. And a couple that come to my mind is, we can see here convulsions. 92 people died of something called convulsions. Anymore, we would call that a symptom and not a disease. But at that time, that's what they considered the cause of the death. Also, there's another one here called gripping in the gut. Same thing, more of a descriptor than an actual title of the disease. 62 people in that week died of gripping in the guts. After this long list of the different types of diseases that were experienced in that week, we also see at the bottom here that there's a count of the christenings and the burials. And that's separated by males and females. And here we go with that information on the plague. There was no plague that week, and there were no parishes infected with the plague. Either it was a pretty good week. There was a good decrease in the burials this week also by 30 people. Statistical studies as we know them today had to have a start somewhere, didn't they? Well, their start was with a gentleman by the name of John Grant. And what John Grant did in 1662 is he published a 256-page document. I'm going to read you the title of this. We all love the way that they titled documents at that time, don't we? And the title of his 256-page document was Natural and Political Observations mentioned in a following indexes and made upon the bills of mortality. So remember those bills of mortality we were just looking at. What John Grant did is he stacked 100 years worth or more of bills of mortality information, however much he had available to him at that time. And he was the first person that started looking at this raw data that was collected and crunching it for statistical value so that it could give purpose and meaning to some of the observations that had been made during that time. This was really cool stuff, you guys. Wow. All of a sudden, all this data that had been collected had a purpose. 30-some years later, Edmund Halley took this same idea of statistical analysis and he came up with the very first life expectancy table. We've run into this before, haven't we? We have this in our world today as far as when we're looking at life insurance policies and annuities. Well, the first one was made in 1693 in England by Edmund Halley. So what's going on in colonial America at that time? Well, they heard about this. They were pretty excited. However, they didn't have the history of the bills of mortality collected. It was still a young country. And they were trying to process how to collect this data. Massachusetts was fairly advanced, and there you could get a birth certificate for as little as 6 pence in 1692. Now remember, there had already been laws in place in Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay Colony, so there were penalties, fines, and even recording fees that were attached to those laws. However, the enforcement of those was weak. And one of the reasons is that immigration was increasing. My goodness, we were being hit with droves of people coming to colonial America. And as these people came to colonial America, they scattered and created their own communities. Now, again, these communities knew that it was important to keep records like the bills of mortality, so they also kept records, but there was no standardization. It would be similar to taking something like the bills of mortality that we just looked at and comparing it to a stack of birth certificates like we have today. It'd be impossible to do any kind of statistical analysis with data that was that far away from one another in regards to the information they collected, wouldn't it be? Let's blow through the 1700s and the early 1800s fairly quickly, but don't be confused because there was a lot going on. There were epidemics of the yellow fever, cholera, and smallpox wiping out up to 11% of communities about every 15 years. Now that's a very generic statement, and don't be confused because it wasn't like you could set a clock to it and you couldn't keep a count or predict a count of it. But about every 15 years, this community or that community was being devastated with these epidemics and these illnesses. And there's no count that's been taken as far as the health of somebody that may have lived through an epidemic and how badly their lifestyle was afterwards. And about the time they'd be coming back out of this epidemic, another one would hit again, but you just didn't know when. You guys, our people were fighting for survival. Organizations were formed to study what was going on. We had the American Health Association and at this time the American Statistical Association, the American Scientific Association forming so that they could figure out why our people were dying. There were heated and passionate debates going on between the quarantiners and the sanitarians. The quarantiners' belief was that if a person was sick, they should be set aside and separated from the other people so that they wouldn't contaminate those that weren't sick. And here we start seeing our tuberculosis camps and hospitals of that sort. However, the sanitarians on this side were saying, no, it's not the fault of the person. Our environment is a mess. We need to clean up our act. Then we'll be able to obtain a better health and a better lifestyle. It's amazing, isn't it, now, 200 years later, that we can reap the benefits of how both of these camps were correct. Government, in the community level, was getting stirred up during this time, too. And we start seeing the development of our first boards of health or Department of Health, whatever that community wanted to call the group that was overlooking the health conditions of that locality. In 1855, a gentleman by the name of John Snow made a breaking discovery, and this was back in London. And what John Snow did in 1855, now this is a couple of years, 100 years after our father of statistical analysis had done his study using the bills of mortality and crunching it for statistical information. Well, by this time, statistics was understood and very interesting. And so what John Snow did is he took those same bills of mortality and he started looking at information, but what he did that was unique is he used maps. Now remember, the bills of mortality didn't have any personal information. They were just a tally of that area and what had been going on. And John Snow was concerned because of the amount of cholera that was killing people at that time. So he actually went to a community and started knocking on all of the doors and finding out if a death of cholera had occurred in that household. And he mapped it out. Here's the map of the Broad Street Pump Station study that John Snow did. And each of the dots represents that a death occurred in that area. Once he sat down with his maps, he realized that the deaths seemed to be radiating out of the Broad Street Pump Station. So of course that made him curious. He went back to that pump station and started looking at the fact that the water was contaminated. These people had died of cholera and had used, digested, even washed with this, actually what it was a combination of fresh water and brown water. There was dumpage going into this actual pump station, where those on the outskirts of it, these other pump stations, were clean. And those deaths that were occurring next to those pump stations, the history of that person could still tie them back to some sort of affiliation to the Broad Street pump station. Oh my goodness, you guys, this was real exciting stuff. Finally, we've got some sort of an answer that John Snow has been able to determine. But what's going on in the United States at this time? We still don't have enough statistical information in order to do an in-depth study like John Snow did. In 1833, only 6% of the states had successful vital registrations. By 1860, those vital registrations are considered complete in only 2 states. And by 1900, only 14 of the then 49 states of America were reporting statistical information. Do you see what's going on here? It's volatile. We keep reaching and failing, and not quite getting enough information in order to do a good, in-depth statistical study of what's creating health problems that we're experiencing. We've all looked at older newspapers, haven't we? And we've seen ads like this: Johann Hoff's malt extract makes flesh and blood. Well, we now consider that a pretty bold statement. But we've all seen historical newspapers advertising elixirs that are cure-alls for all kinds of problems. And this just goes to witness what our ancestors were looking for. They were looking for an answer, anything that would help them live through whatever illness was coming their way, and they just didn't know what it would be or what was causing it. Ralph Waldo Emerson even had something to say about this. Kind of gives you an idea of the attitude of the country, doesn't it? He said, the first wealth is health. Health was an issue during this time of the 17 and 1800s. Well, we were struggling to get some sort of standardized information. And a gentleman by the name of Lemuel Shattuck said, hey, we got the Census Bureau, and they're going out every 10 years, and they're collecting information about our people. Why don't we get them to have a schedule to the census that can collect standardized information so that when it's returned, we can actually do some in-depth statistical studies. So this was a great idea. And so this is when we start seeing the mortality schedules. The mortality schedules are available for 1850, 60, 1870, and 1880. Those decennial censuses immediately following Lemuel Shattuck's suggestion. Let's take a look at a mortality schedule here. I clipped this from Family Search because I really appreciated the way that they had the balloons describing the information that was collected on these mortality schedules. So of course we've got the name of the deceased person and the age, the sex, the color, they're married, where they're born, when they died, what their occupation was, their cause of death. And the last column here, which there is not a balloon for, is the numbers of days that this deceased person was ill. So these enumerators would go around door to door, and they would ask the questions that we see the answers to on the United States population census. And then they would ask, has anyone in your household died within the last year or so? And if they came up with the answer of why, yes, there has, then the enumerator would turn to this mortality schedule. They would then proceed to ask the questions that would answer the fields that were on this form. And what they found out after 4 censuses or 40 years of doing this study is that the people that were left behind, those loved ones that answered the question, yes, we did have someone die in this home, is that those people didn't necessarily know the answers to the questions that the enumerator was asking, believe it or not. And so especially how many days that this person was ill was hard to remember a year and a half later. Or what was the actual disease or cause of that person's death. A lot of times, even where the person was born or the death month was hard to remember. So even though this was a great idea and we tried it for 4 decades, it still didn't meet the mark. What we determined is that the information needed to be taken down or recorded closer to the actual event's occurrence. Another reason why I picked this particular image from Family Search is that I liked some of the information it was sharing here. And what we can see under the age is that we've got 3 of the 5 individuals that have died on this mortality schedule under 1 year old. This was starting to become obvious, and it was not only in the information that was collected, but observation that our children were in danger. Our children were not reaching adulthood, and there was a high infant mortality rate. Well, going back to the problem of being able to get the data at the time of the occurrence, the United States Census Bureau came up with this idea. They said, okay, we understand that we need to record this information when it occurs, so let's create a death certificate. So the United States Census Bureau created these death certificates, and they gave them to physicians. And they said, Mr. Physician, please fill this out at the time of the person's death that you are attending, or just as soon as you hear that someone in your community has died. And by that way, we'll be able to collect the information closer to the event. And the idea was that at the next census in 1890, these death certificates would be collected from those physicians. Well, that too was a great idea, but was problematic in that a lot of times the physicians forgot to record the information because it wasn't something that they were used to doing, or fires occurred, or physicians moved away and the records got scattered, or the physicians were traveling physicians and the records got lost. There were all kinds of issues that went on with this too. And so even though it was a great idea, it didn't get us the information that we needed. Well, by 1902, the United States Census Bureau comes into its own, doesn't it? Finally, after over 100 years of the Census Bureau coming together to do the decennial census and then breaking apart until there was a need for it again, it was very busy with all of the additional schedules that were requested and all of the information that it was asked to gather. Well, one of the first things that the Census Bureau did when it was made a permanent agency is it established something called registration areas for births and for deaths. Now, don't be confused. I sure was for a while. But these registration areas are more of a measurement of success. They're an award criteria, or award based on criteria. The geographical areas are still the states, and so the estates were awarded entry into a registration area by passing a 90 percentile of submission of the vital record information requested by the Census Bureau. Well, this was one of the things that the Census Bureau did as soon as it became a permanent agency, but it's desperate to get out there and collect this birth and death information that we've been trying for a while now to get collected. So the other thing that the United States Census Bureau did is it formed alliances. By this time, there was the American Public Health Association, along with the American Statistical Association, Scientific Association, Medical Association, Health Association, all kinds of different camps that were all interested in making sure that we collected this information, or trying to get us to a point that we had enough standardized information to conduct in-depth statistical studies. The strongest alliance that the United States Census Bureau built was with the Federal Children's Bureau. Now, the history of the Children's Bureau goes back to about 1907, but it was officially formed in 1912. They did a lot of good work, and their work spread into childhood education, fair labor acts. But one of the things that they were really gung-ho for is getting birth registrations and birth certificates going. One of the major reasons that there was so much power or so much passion on the Children's Bureau part to get birth certificates is that their biggest concern was this high infant mortality rate. And the only way that we could trace what was going on is if there was a way to start, a way to collect the information of our children at the point of the event occurrence, at the time of their birth. And so they started this huge campaign to get birth certificates created. I so enjoy studying the Children's Bureau because they were very creative in the way that they got information out to the public. They came up with handbooks on how to care for a newborn and an infant and a child that told you how to feed them, how to dress them. Yes, you guys, that our ancestors needed a little bit of education in this aspect. Some of the ways that the Children's Bureau got the information out to the public was by using these cartoons. I'm going to show you a couple here. I enjoy this one. This is Mr. C.T. Texas. You can tell that because it's written on his handbag. And he's walking out in the world. He's leaving home. And he's being bombarded with questions like, where were you born? Who's your mother? Who's your father? How old are you? Now, these are questions that we have the answers to, and we take that for granted today. But in 1914, when this cartoon was shared, evidently not everybody did have the answers to these questions readily available, or the Children's Bureau wouldn't have been asking people to make sure that their children had it available to them. The caption in this cartoon is, Texas young men should be equipped to answer these questions. One of the big debates that the Children's Bureau had was that the United States government was helping the agricultural industry a lot by doing scientific studies on how to have the best crop or raise the more quality meat that would come to our tables. And what the Children's Bureau is like, that's a really good idea, but what about our children? Our children need some help. They need some scientific studies. They need some money thrown in their direction. They're dying. And this cartoon really emphasizes that. Here we have a circle with a line down the middle. And on one side of the circle, we have a pig, and that pig's looking up over its pin. And on the side of the pin is registration number 4789761. On the other side of the circle is an infant in a cradle. Underneath the pig is the word registered. Underneath the infant, not registered, with the caption of why. So do you see how the Children's Bureau is trying to bring it to the attention of, we need registration for our children. We've got them for our pigs. We need them for our children too. The Children's Bureau also started a contest. Now, these contests were called the Better Babies contests, and they were held at state fairs every year. They would go around having different groups of the Children's Bureau located at state fairs throughout the country, and they would have these Better Babies contests. And what this contest was is there was a matrix built, and this matrix was at a certain age, this child should be able to perform these type of functions, and at a certain age, a better baby should weigh this much and be this long and have these features. And a parent could enter the contest and bring their child to this Better Baby contest, and measure their infant against this predetermined matrix. Well, the Women's Home Journal got real excited about this, and they got very active in sponsoring these Better Baby contests. These contests went on, like I said before, annually, but in the state of Washington in the year of 1914, this particular young lady, the picture here of Catherine Land, was a Better Baby contestant winner. Now here we see her as a young adult, don't we? Yay, she made it. She made it through those hard baby years. She measured up against the matrix, and she was found passing, or a winner, and it proved that she was what they were looking for, a surviving human. Statewide, in 1914, the state of Washington had 101 winners, and Pasco had 8 of those. One of the things that the Children's Bureau, in shaking hands with the Census Bureau, did was come up with these notifications of birth registrations. And this is how it worked. First, the child is, of course, born. And then an attendant of the birth, and they found out at that time that most births were being attended by either a midwife or in a hospital, an attendant completes the birth certificate. Now you might ask the question about, you know that your ancestor's birth wasn't attended. What happened in that case? Remember, the Children's Bureau had been bombarding the public with information of make sure the child is registered. And so they were doing the best they could to get the information out there to make sure that there was a record of the birth. So the attendant completes his birth certificate, and then the birth certificate is sent to the state office. Now, state offices by this time all had different titles. They were, remember back in the 1700s or so, the communities that were starting to build, I guess 1600s, the communities that were starting to build these local departments of health and how they all had different names, well, that's still going. And by this time, we've got state-level offices. But they might be the Board of Health, or again, they might be that state district health office. They have various names. So we're just going to call them state offices here. And that state office would receive the birth certificate. Then the state office would take the information from the birth certificate and write it in a register, and then take the little certificate and file it appropriately in their office. Then they would take a copy of that register and send it to the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau was thrilled. They were finally starting to get some standardized information. And so what they would do is the Census Bureau would record that information themselves off of that register, and they would also send a letter titled the Notification of Birth Registration to the parents. Now what this letter said is, congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Parent, we understand that you have a new infant in the house, and we have this information about them. So please review it, make sure that it's correct, and if there are any necessary changes that need to be made, please go back to your state office and let them know about it. Sincerely, Census Bureau. That was it. This notification of birth registration became important to a lot of people because it was a proof that there was a record of their birth. Even yet today at the Social Security Administration website, I found in my research that there's a policy that if a clerk is presented with this letter, notification of birth registration, as proof of a person's age, that clerk should look at it for possible originality, or does it look original, does it look authentic, and if so, accept it as a legal document. But what was going on then? Well, right about this same time, there was a lot of history going on, was being built in the United States of America. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and that began the Great Depression. We needed some relief pretty soon. And so the old age pension, which became the forerunner of our Social Security, began in 1935. But in order to qualify for it, you had to be able to prove your age. Now, I will take a break from this for a moment to let you know that this is where family Bibles came to play. If you could prove your age by being able to show the information recorded in the family Bible, that would work. But what if you couldn't? What if you didn't have access to that family Bible? Or what if that family Bible had been destroyed or lost somewhere? Well, around the same time, the Children's Bureau was, remember, very active, and there was a Fair Labor Standards Act which fixed the minimum age for employment of children. Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, bringing the United States into World War II, and immediately jobs were created in the defense industry. However, you had to be a citizen of the United States in order to qualify for these jobs. Oh my goodness, all of a sudden being able to prove your age and your citizenship is extremely important. There's money attached to it. Money's always important. And so there was information from this notification of birth registration that a birth certificate existed. So now people are saying, we want those. We want our birth certificates. Well, the retorting cry from the state offices was like, egad, we need some help. They're being slammed with requests for copies of these birth certificates. They had no idea that this was coming, and they weren't set up for the amount of requests that were being made for copies of these documents. There had been no standardization established between states. So a birth certificate in this state and a birth certificate in this state might share similar information because we were working so hard on standardizing the information that was sent to the Census Bureau. But the states were left up to forming the certificates in whatever way they wanted to. And this created problems because a person from the state of Washington who may not quite look their age and wanted to gain employment in the state of Oregon or Idaho would take their birth certificate once they acquired it to this other state and apply for a job and say, I am old enough to work even though I don't look like I am. And that potential employer would be going, this doesn't look like anything I've ever seen before. I don't know what kind of game you're trying to pull, but this isn't a birth certificate. And so that person would run back to the state office and say, what am I supposed to do? Again, the state offices were like, ah! At the same time, there was so much going on with the Census Bureau, and they were collecting even more and more information to crunch statistics, that the federal Vital Statistics Department was taken away from the Census Bureau and moved under the Surgeon General's office. Well, this is proof, isn't it, that those vital statistics were more important when it came to a medical aspect than a statistical aspect. Even at this point, we're like, we still need to get it together. We still need to get our health statistics together so we can figure out what's going on. Now, when the Federal Vital Statistics Department was reorganized and put under the Surgeon General's office, they wanted to help these state offices that were crying out. But what they decided to do is, instead of destroy and rebuild, they became an agency that just provided information on how to help. They allowed those state offices, after hundreds of years of building up their own organization, naming their own departments to do whatever the functions were that was necessary to conduct business, they left those as they were. And the Federal Vital Statistics Department became an overseer to help, but not to run these state offices. Yay! By 1933, yes, we finally got all 48 states and the District of Columbia have met the requirements to be included in the birth registration and the death registration areas. Whew. Wow. When you go back to that first article, or that first introductory statement by Ovida Cole-Pobby and Leonard A. Schill, written in 1950, and they're saying that it's only within this present generation that we've been able to meet the mark, I guess they're right. And I guess there was 2 centuries of struggle to try to get here. Well, remember the old age pension? Okay, now we got some additional problems, but that's okay because we got our state offices now. They're more prepared to meet the requests that are coming their way, and what they've got now is an overseeing authority department, which is the Federal Vital Statistics Office, right? So what's happened now is that people are requesting birth certificates for births that occurred before the registration of births was required. That's okay. What we'll do is we'll do a delayed birth certificate. And the procedures that came down helped the states form how this would be conducted. And believe it or not, there are on websites today that I've looked at, there are still procedures for delayed registration of births or a delayed birth certificate should a birth occur that is not properly recorded with a birth certificate at the time of the event. So what happens is that the person would need to apply to the state where their birth occurred. They would need to have 3 supporting documents providing the name, the place, and the date of the birth, but only one of those supporting documents can be an affidavit of personal knowledge. Remember, these were suggested guidelines. These were not mandated laws. So let's take a look at some delayed birth certificates. I just love it when the best examples come from my own files, don't you? So I get to share with you today some delayed birth certificates from my own family files. Here we have a delayed certificate of birth for Charles Martin Rose. One of the reasons that I love sharing this birth certificate is my excitement at the time of finding it. I had done a lot of research on Charles Martin Rose, and I was haunted by the fact that I always found his birth recorded as April 10th. Always. There was never, ever an issue about that. However, there was an issue about the year. Sometimes it was 1885, and sometimes it was 1887. Never 1886 or any other date, 85 and 87. Well, I was at the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, and I was excited when I found out that there was a roll of film, microfilm, on delayed birth certificates for Illinois, where I knew he was born, in Livingston County. So I rushed over and I threw the microfilm into the reader, and I pulled it up, and look at what I've got here. I don't know if you can see it, but here it says, the date of birth is April 10th, 1885 is crossed out, and 1887 is written on top of it. I don't know that I'll ever figure out when this gentleman was born. Anyway, some of the exciting things that I found about this is, now remember, this is in Livingston County, Illinois, is on this particular birth certificate, it lists his father's name and his mother's name, where they were born, blah, blah, blah. And it says, there's a little box that says, I hereby certify that I was the attendant at this birth. And in this particular instance, it has the physician's name type, and then behind his name it says deceased. So here's the name of the physician. However, he was not able to sign this document because he had died before it was created. And then below that, it says, if signature of birth attendant is obtainable, an affidavit is not required. So evidently, the state of Illinois had decided that they didn't want to follow the suggestions of the Federal Vital Statistics Department. They decided if you could prove your birth by either a signature of a physician or an affidavit if someone was there, that was good enough for them. And so sure enough, Charles Martin Rose was able to obtain an affidavit from his uncle, Henry H. Newberger. Now, this particular delayed birth certificate was created in 1942, right about that time. Remember, we were talking about by 1941, there were procedures in place that could be followed for states to come up with these delayed certificates of birth. Well, as I was looking at this document on microfilm, I was fascinated because the next page of it was an affidavit and certificate of correction. And here we see where Charles Rose actually corrected his birth date from April 10th, 1885 to April 10th, 1887. Go figure. But what I found interesting about this is that this correction was submitted in 1961. So even though there were methods in place, there were also methods in place to correct any of the certificates that were created. Well, here's another delayed birth certificate. And on the title of this one, it says, delayed or special certificate of birth. Now, this is for my great-grandmother, Viva Mignon Betterton. And at the time that she applied for her delayed certificate of birth, she was living in Colorado. However, her birth occurred in Missouri. So remember, she had to go back to the state where her birth occurred. And this particular delayed certificate of birth was requested or given in 1955. Now, in Missouri, there was a request for 3 documents, remember, but only one of them could be an affidavit of a person that attended the birth. And so the third one here is the affidavit of E.S. Betterton, her uncle, and it was written in 1955 about the time that she applied for this delayed birth certificate. what was fascinating to me is the other two pieces of documentation that she used in order to apply for this delayed birth certificate were birth records of children that she bore. Yes, believe it or not, she used her own children's birth certificates to prove her own birth. Because, on most birth certificates, it lists the father's name, the mother's name, and where and when they were born. Well, what's even funnier about that is that one of these two birth certificates of her children wasn't filed until 1942. It itself was a delayed certificate of birth. That's fascinating. Okay, we have just spent at least a half an hour talking about the history of birth certificates and death certificates. But there's still vital records in regards to marriages and divorces too, aren't there? And we're going to cover them a little bit, but we're going to blow through them really fast because we've got the handout to look at on where you can go to find some of the records that you're interested in on your ancestors. The history behind marriages and divorces is rich, and it's full of various issues. We've just talked about all the issues that led up to birth and death certificates. Can you imagine the issues in the history of marriage and divorce certificates? Think about it. Property rights, land ownership, racial segregation, religious beliefs, public health issues. And right now, today, we're seeing history made with gender debates in regards to marriages and divorces. When marriages and divorces are recorded, the originating focus has typically been based on financial security, not on health issues like birth and death certificates. And because of this, records for marriages and divorces have been kept in various record files depending upon how the organizations of that particular area decides to keep their records. So in previous years, more antiquated years, we can find marriage records in town records. We can find them embedded within land records, not just that there was a marriage, but that an actual certificate of the marriage itself just kind of embedded within there. We can also find them in vital statistics files or even only in church documents. So they've been hit and miss and kind of scattered all over the place. In more recent times, there's been a demand for proof of marriages and divorces by government and private agencies, especially when it comes to time of probate and distributing property left behind by an individual and making sure that you can prove a marriage or divorce situation. Well, our lawyers got involved with this because it was just taking them plumb too long to figure out where the documentation for marriages and divorces existed. So they went to the Vital Records office and they said, we really need some help. Don't we love our lawyers? They're our best lobbying agents, and they came to play for us in this situation as well. Well, what was determined when our lawyers went to the Vital Records office is that the Vital Records office is like, hey, wait a minute. We had some pretty good successes using the idea of registration areas for our birth and death registrations. And so in 1956, registration areas were established for marriages and divorces. Again, let's go back and look at what registration areas meant. It was not a geographical area. I really wish they would have used a different word, but a registration area was a stamp of approval. And so these registration areas for marriages and divorces were based on the same thing. The geographical area, being a state, would meet the registration area criteria and be brought into that area once they passed a 90% filing approval, or got 90% of their records filed, the information from them filed at the federal level. So records even yet today are created and they're filed at either the state or the county level. And even yet today, my daughter being married in May, she still had to go and request a copy of her marriage certificate. It's not just automatically sent. However, the statistics of, just like the birth certificates, the statistics of the information collected on the marriage or the divorce record were sent to the federal level. And that was the 90% completion that they were looking for, or 90% or more of the records created in that vicinity getting sent to the federal level. If so, they have met the criteria to be brought into the registration area. Well, in 1996, the requirements again changed. However, the impact had been long-lasting. One of the things that was needed in order to meet the registration area is that indexes needed to be created at a state level, and they needed to be able to be sorted by the groom's name and also by the bride's name. This way, a lawyer could go and make a request about that person and find out if there was a marriage record, if so, what county and what department was it filed in. These are still available, and the momentum for this index at the state level had already happened. So at this point, because our state offices are self-run, even though they're provided instructions on how best to run it, a lot of times those indexes have been maintained and kept forward. Many states never quite met the criteria to be brought into the registration area and never really kept good indexes of their marriages and divorces. Sorry to say, this is kind of a hit and miss. However, I'm excited that there is a hit possibility. You should, if you're looking for a marriage divorce, request a lookup from the index. See if there's an index for that state. And then ask for the information as far as which county that certificate exists in, so that you can just go and obtain that instead of having to go from county to county to county. I know personally I'm looking for a marriage that happened in Oklahoma that would have been during a time that would have been of interest, and yet the state of Oklahoma never met the registration area criteria. So let's go ahead and look at the handout here. Important dates in the history of vital record registration. Okay, the states are listed down the left-hand side of the column, and then the first two columns give you the dates that records on file for the entire area are available. The next two columns give you the date that they were admitted into the registration area for deaths and for births. And the far two right columns are when state indexes started being available for marriages and divorces. Let's look at like the state of Arkansas here. Records on file for the entire area for deaths and for births for Arkansas, we can look for them as early as 1914. However, they were not admitted into the registration area until 1927. Well, what does that tell us? For about 13 years there, it's kind of iffy. That means from 1914 is when they first, as a state, decided that they needed to make this a law, until 1927, when they were admitted into the Census Bureau's registration area. They didn't meet the 90% completion or submittal criteria. So if you're looking for a birth or a death certificate between 1914 and 1927, this would tell you you're encouraged to do so. However, if you don't find it, don't be disheartened. It may not exist. You know, some of these other dates are fascinating. Goes back to like Maine, 1892, 1841 for Massachusetts. And they were available for births as early as 1915 in the registration area. Pretty good chances that you're going to find something. In Massachusetts, marriages are indexed as of 1841, but for divorces as early as 1952. So this just kind of gives you a guideline on when you can kind of expect to find the documents that you're looking for within these states at those times. Please write this URL down. I did not put it on your handout, but we will take a look at it here in just a second. This will tell us where information online is available. It's at www.cdc.gov/N as in Nancy, C as in cat, H as in Henry, S as in Susan, so NCHS/W2W.htm. I'll give you a chance to write that down. Our current Vital Statistics Office is now under the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. So that's where you get that CDC in the URL. And what we have here is the website that I just gave you the URL for. And it gives us, from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's point of view, where you should write for vital records. You don't have to go through vital records. You can actually go to these area locations. And underneath each of these states and territories of the United States, it even has Puerto Rico, American Samoa listed here. You will find on this next page here, this is for the state of Washington, it gives you detailed information on birth, death, marriage, and divorces. And they keep this information updated. I mean, this is a federal website that's available for you, including a hyperlink to the website of the department that would have the certification that you're requesting. Here, when we're talking about dates, it's kind of interesting to see that in the state of Washington, birth certificates are available as early as 1907, so are death certificates. But marriages and divorces are available since 1968. Now, I spent some time with Bridget over at the Ellensburg Regional Office of the Washington State Archives, and she explained to me that we actually have marriage and divorce indexes available a lot earlier than this, and many times she has received requests to look up this index to see where a marriage or a divorce has occurred, and she, without hesitation, provides that information as far as the date and the county that it was filed in. So there's a couple of options available for you there. So why do we need to understand the history of vital records? What's important to it for us? Well, I love this quote from Winston Churchill. He says it all, doesn't he? Study history. Study history. In history lies all the secrets of statecraft. And as genealogists, if we have a background or an understanding of why a document is created and what went into creating that document, processing, and the purposes that it served, it helps us to get a better understanding of our people and what was represented by the information that was recorded on that document for them, doesn't it? And I sure know by doing this study, it sure has given me appreciation of what our country went through, and of course our ancestors that were involved during this time of getting the United States of America to a point of having vital records registrations. I would love to entertain any kind of questions that you might have at this time. Thank you.